Notification came at 7:42 in the morning. I was still in my robe, standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee to finish. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I picked it up without thinking. A transaction alert from my bank. $237. Online purchase. A clothing site I'd never heard of. I set the phone down and stared at the coffee pot. The thing is, I already knew. Not about that specific charge, I hadn't seen that one yet, but somewhere in the back of my mind, in that place where a man keeps the things he doesn't want to look at directly, I already knew. I just kept pretending I didn't. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 63 years old, retired after 31 years in municipal water management, and I made the same mistake twice in my life. I trusted the wrong person with access to my money. The first time I was 28 and naive. The second time I was 59 and should have known better. The second time is the story I want to tell you. Her name was Suzanne. We met at a church potluck dinner in the fall of 2019, which sounds about as romantic as filing your taxes, and I won't pretend otherwise. My daughter had dragged me there. Said I needed to get out of the house. Said I'd been alone long enough since my divorce from my first wife, which had been finalized 3 years earlier after 22 years of a marriage that had run out of whatever it started with, somewhere around year 16. Suzanne was funny. That was the first thing. She laughed at something I said about the green bean casserole, and I thought, well, that's something. She was 54 at the time, a few years younger than me, a bookkeeper at a small dental practice, warm, easy to talk to. She had a son from her first marriage, her only marriage, she said. He was 25 years old, and his name was Darren. I want to be fair about Darren, because fair matters to me. He wasn't a bad person in the way that some people are bad. He wasn't mean. He didn't lie to my face. Not exactly, not in ways I could point to clearly. He was just adrift. That's the word I kept coming back to. 25 years old, living with his mother, working part-time at a sporting goods store when he felt like it, between jobs more often than not. Every time I asked how things were going with work, there was a new story. The manager didn't like him. The hours got cut. There was a better opportunity he was looking into. He was always looking into something. I noticed all of this before I married Suzanne. I want to be honest about that. I saw it clearly. I just told myself it wasn't my problem. He was her son, not mine. My 2 kids were grown, independent, living their own lives in other states. I figured I wasn't marrying Darren. I was marrying Suzanne. We got married at Zurn. We got married in June of 2021. Small ceremony. Her family, my family, some friends. It was a good day. I remember thinking it was a genuinely good day. We moved into my house, which I owned outright, paid off the mortgage in 2017, one of the few things I was proud of. It was a 3-bedroom, ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood outside of Tucson. Nice yard, 2-car garage, more space than I needed for just me. Darren was not part of the plan. Suzanne had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment with him before we married. The understanding was that when she moved in with me, Darren would get his own place. He'd had 4 months of lead time to figure it out. He was 26 by then. This did not seem unreasonable to me. 2 weeks before the wedding, Suzanne sat me down and explained that Darren hadn't quite sorted things out yet. He was waiting on a deposit refund from his last apartment. He'd had some unexpected expenses. It would just be a few weeks, maybe a month at the outside, and then he'd have his own place. Could he please stay in the 3rd bedroom temporarily? I said yes, because I was about to marry this woman. Because it was 1 month. Because what 1 month? Because what kind of man says no to that? He stayed for 19 months. I want to walk you through how it happened, because it didn't happen all at once. That's how these things work. They don't arrive with sirens. They arrive in small, reasonable-sounding increments. The first month, Darren was fine. Polite. Kept to himself mostly. Helped with some yard work without being asked, which I appreciated. I thought, okay, this is manageable. Month 2, he was between jobs again. The sporting goods store had let him go. Reduced staff, he said. He was applying places. In the meantime, could Suzanne and I cover his phone bill? just until he got back on his feet. It was $93. I said, fine. Month 3, his car needed new brake pads. He'd gotten a quote $412. He didn't have it. Suzanne looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression I was starting to recognize, a kind of soft pleading that didn't use words. I paid for the brakes. This is the part I replay sometimes, not because of the $400, but because that was the moment I should have sat down with both of them and said, here's how this works, here is what the arrangement is, here is what I expect. I didn't do that. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was a good kid going through a rough patch. I let it slide. By month 6, Darren had a debit card linked to the household account. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. But let me explain, because there was a logic to it at the time, a logic that made sense inside the warm bubble of a new marriage where you want to believe the best. Suzanne and I had a joint account for household expenses, groceries, utilities, home maintenance. She'd suggested it early on, and I agreed because it seemed like the practical thing to do. She was handling more of the household management since I was still adjusting to retirement and honestly not paying close enough attention to the daily details. The idea was that Darren would use the card for grocery runs, for picking up household items when we needed them. He was home during the day. It was supposed to be convenient. There were no conversations about limits, no written agreements, no monthly reviews. I handed him access to an account that my paycheck was deposited into and told myself it would be fine. The first charge I noticed was at a sneaker store, $180. I asked Suzanne about it and she said Darren had needed new work shoes. He'd just gotten a new job, a warehouse position. Steel-toed boots were required. It was a one-time thing. She'd pay me back from her paycheck. She did not pay me back. The second charge I noticed was at a gaming electronics website, $260. When I asked, Suzanne said it must be a mistake. She'd look into it. I later found a new controller and a headset in Darren's room when I was looking for the circuit breaker manual. I brought it up, calmly. I want to say that because it matters to me that I stayed calm. I sat down with Suzanne on a Sunday evening and I went through the charges on my phone. I laid them out. The shoes, the electronics, the fast food that added up to $40 and $60 at a time, the 2 months of streaming subscriptions I didn't recognize. In 3 months, Darren had spent roughly $1,400 from my account on things that had nothing to do with household expenses. Suzanne's response was not what I had hoped for. She said I was being rigid. She said family doesn't keep score. She said Darren was going through a difficult time, and the least we could do was support him. She said she was embarrassed that her husband was sitting there with a spreadsheet like he was auditing her son. I did not have a spreadsheet. I had a phone. But I understood what she was doing with that word, embarrassed, and I sat with it, and I let it matter to me more than it should have. I told myself, this is a blended family. These things take adjustment. I removed Darren's access to the debit card that same week. I felt like I'd done the right thing. What I didn't do was check the joint account carefully enough after that, because the card wasn't the only access point. Suzanne had always handled the bills. She knew the login credentials. She managed the account. I checked in periodically, but I wasn't looking at every line item, every transaction. I'm going to own that. I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been. 6 months later, I was looking at a charge for a used car part, a specific part from a specific shop in our city that I knew nothing about. Darren had gotten a different car by then, a second-hand pickup truck he was making payments on. I drove past the shop later that week. The invoice had his truck's make and model in the transaction description, $450. I didn't say anything that night. I sat with it. I looked back at 6 months of statements and I started writing things down in a notebook I kept in my nightstand, the kind of small, spiral notebook I used to use for field notes when I was still working. I did this carefully. Over about 2 weeks, what I found was roughly $3,200 in charges that were either directly Darren's, his name appearing in subscription accounts, purchases shipped to a P.O. box I found in his room, charges on days I knew I'd been out of town, or charges that Suzanne had made and that she had never mentioned, never discussed with me, that had nothing to do with household needs as I understood them. A spa day. Tickets to a concert I was not invited to. A significant grocery run on a week when I had been the one doing the shopping. I closed that notebook and I put it in my truck, in the glove compartment, away from the house. The conversation I had with Suzanne that November was the worst one of my marriage, not because of the yelling. There wasn't much yelling, actually, because of what it revealed about the foundation. I laid everything out, calmly, not accusatory in tone, just factual. Here are the charges. Here are the dates. Here's what I found. I've been tracking this for 2 months. Suzanne started with denial, moved to minimizing, settled on attack. I was controlling. I was paranoid. I was treating her son like a criminal. She had spent 25 years raising that boy alone, and she would not sit in her own home and be made to feel ashamed for helping him. I want to note that she said her own home. She had been living in my house for 2 years. I paid the mortgage, the property taxes, the insurance, the utilities. Her name was not on the deed. I had made this clear before we married, not as a threat, but as a fact. She had agreed to it. Darren sat in the living room during most of this conversation. I could see him through the doorway. He didn't come in. He didn't say anything. He just sat there with his phone. The argument ended without resolution. Suzanne went to bed angry. I sat in the kitchen until almost midnight and thought about what I was going to do. What I decided was this. I would give it 3 months. I would propose a formal arrangement. Darren would pay $250 a month if he was going to continue living here. His access to the joint account would end completely. Suzanne and I would do a monthly review of household spending together. 3 months to show me that things could change. That was the offer. Suzanne said she'd think about it. 2 days later, she agreed, with the condition that the monthly contribution from Darren wouldn't start until he was more stable. I should have said no to that condition. I said fine. The monthly contribution never started. What did start was a change in the texture of daily life in my house. Suzanne was cooler. Not hostile, but careful, measured, like she was managing me instead of being married to me. Darren avoided me more than before. There was a period of 3 or 4 months where things felt almost normal, and I let myself believe we'd turned a corner. Then I got a call from my bank about a flagged transaction. A sporting goods store. Not the one Darren had worked at before, a different one. $312. The fraud department was asking if I'd authorized it. I hadn't. I told them I hadn't. They canceled the transaction and began a review. I hung up the phone and sat in my truck in the parking lot of the hardware store where I'd been picking up weather stripping, and I thought about that night at the kitchen table when I had removed Darren's card access. What I hadn't done was change the account number. What I hadn't done was change the joint account login. What I hadn't done was verify that the only active debit card was mine. I drove to my bank branch that afternoon, not the drive-thru. Inside, I sat down with one of the account managers, a patient woman who didn't ask unnecessary questions, and I told her I needed to make some changes. I opened a new individual checking account. I set up my Social Security deposit and my small pension to route to the new account only. I requested a new debit card for the new account. I changed all the login credentials for my primary accounts and set up multi-factor authentication on everything. I did not close the joint account. Not yet. I left a small buffer in there, enough to cover the auto-pay utilities that still ran through it, and I made a note to transfer those over one by one. The account manager asked if I needed information about other services. I told her I was fine. I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot for a while. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I was not angry in that hot, impulsive way. I was something more like resolved, the way I used to feel at the end of a complicated job, when the water pressure was finally right and the lines were tested and everything was sealed correctly. Quiet. Certain. I drove home. Suzanne was in the kitchen when I came in. Darren was at the table eating lunch. They both looked up when I walked in, and there was something in the way they looked at me, a kind of alertness, like they'd been in the middle of something, that I filed away. I said hello. I put the weather stripping in the garage. I came back in and poured myself a glass of water. Normal afternoon. Nothing to indicate that anything had changed. That evening, Suzanne tried to use the debit card at the pharmacy. She called me from the parking lot, confused. My card isn't working, she said. Which card? The joint account card. I took a breath. I had some fraud issues with the account. I'm sorting it out. Can you call the bank? I'm at the pharmacy right now. Get what you need tonight and I'll sort it out in the morning, I said. Do you have your own card with you? There was a pause. Yeah, fine. She came home 20 minutes later and didn't say anything more about it that night. The next morning, she asked me about the account. I told her there had been unauthorized activity and I was in the process of restructuring the accounts for security. She asked what that meant. I told her it meant the joint account was being simplified. It would cover household utilities and shared grocery runs with a set monthly transfer from me, and all other expenses would be managed separately. Separately, she repeated. Yes. She set her coffee cup down on the counter. Are you saying you don't trust me? I had thought about how to answer this. I'd thought about it for about 3 weeks, which is why I was able to answer it clearly and without heat. I'm saying the current arrangement isn't working, I said. We've had over $4,000 in charges that I didn't authorize and that weren't discussed. That's not a trust question, that's a pattern. I'm adjusting to the pattern. She started to say something and then Darren walked into the kitchen. He was still in his sleep clothes, even though it was past 10. He looked at his mother, then at me, and he understood that he'd walked into something. To his credit, he started to back out. No, stay, Suzanne said. So he stayed, and we had the conversation with him there. I said what I had already said to Suzanne. I didn't add to it. I didn't perform for Darren's benefit. I told her this was how things would work going forward. I wasn't asking permission. I was stating a fact. Darren looked at the floor for most of it. When I was finished, he said, I'm sorry, man. I know I let things get out of hand. I looked at him for a moment. 27 years old, sleep-rumpled, a little ashamed. I thought about the man he might eventually become when the drift finally tired him out. I appreciate you saying that, I told him. And I meant it. Suzanne was quiet for the rest of the day. The weeks that followed were not comfortable. I'm not going to paint this as a clean victory because marriages don't work that way. I'm too old to pretend otherwise. Suzanne began looking for apartments. I found this out not because she told me, but because her laptop was open on the kitchen counter one afternoon, and I wasn't snooping. The screen was simply visible as I walked past. She was on an apartment listing site. 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, the price range suggesting she intended to take Darren with her. I made an appointment with a family law attorney the following week, not because I had decided on divorce, because I needed to understand where I stood. The attorney was direct and helpful. She walked me through the relevant Arizona statutes, the question of separate versus marital property, what my exposure looked like. Because the house was mine before the marriage and remained in my name alone, my position was better than I'd feared. I came home from that appointment feeling something I can only describe as clear, not happy, not relieved, clear. I told Suzanne that evening that I thought we needed to either get into counseling together or start talking seriously about what we both actually wanted going forward. I said it carefully. I said I wasn't trying to end things, but I wasn't willing to continue things the way they had been. She said she needed more time to think. I gave her 2 weeks. She spent a lot of that time on the phone with her sister. Darren spent more time out of the house, which I suspected was connected to pressure from Suzanne. At the end of the 2 weeks, she told me she was moving out. She and Darren had found a 2-bedroom apartment about 4 miles from my house. She gave me 30 days' notice, which was more than I'd asked for. I told her I appreciated that. The last month was quiet and not unkind. We were careful with each other. We ate dinner together most nights. We talked about practical things, forwarding her mail, transferring the 1 utility that was in her name on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks before she left. We sat on the back porch together and drank iced tea, and she said she was sorry things had ended up this way. Me too, I said, and I meant that also. I think I kept hoping it would just work itself out, she said. I think I did too, for a while. She looked out at the yard. I'd been putting in some new plantings along the fence line, desert willow, a couple of agave, and she'd watched me do it over the past few weeks without comment. You're going to be fine, she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just as a statement of fact. I know, I said. Suzanne moved out on a Thursday in March. Darren helped her with the boxes. I helped with the furniture. The three of us carried her things out of my house without drama, which was more than I'd hoped for. When they drove away in the loaded truck, I stood in the driveway for a minute and then went inside. I transferred the remaining utilities out of the joint account. I closed the joint account the following Monday. I sat down that evening with a cup of coffee and my banking app, and I looked at my balance, and I felt the particular kind of peace that comes not from getting something you wanted, but from stopping something that was wrong. I changed the locks that weekend, not out of distrust. Suzanne had given me her keys back properly the day she left, but because the house was mine again in a way I'd let it stop being, and changing the locks felt like the right punctuation. I called my daughter that evening. Told her things had ended with Suzanne. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, how are you doing?" I told her the truth. I told her I was okay. I told her I felt old in some ways and clear in others. I told her I had put in some new plants along the back fence and they seemed to be doing well. She laughed a little. She knew what I meant. Here is what I know now that I didn't know well enough then. 63 years is long enough to have made most of the mistakes available to a man, and what that buys you, if you're paying attention, is the ability to recognize them faster the next time. Not fast enough, maybe, not as fast as I would have liked, but faster. The joint account was the first compromise that cost me, not because joint accounts are wrong. They're not in the right circumstances, but because I handed over access without a framework, without a conversation, without limits. I assumed good faith would substitute for structure. It doesn't. It never does. Good faith is what you have while you're building the structure. It is not the structure itself. The second thing I know is that the hardest part of any of this isn't the money. The money is actually the easy part, because money is concrete. You can see it, measure it, recover it. The hard part is the slower erosion of your own judgment, the way you stop trusting what you see because you don't want to make things difficult, because you're trying to be a good husband, because it seems unkind to count things when someone you love is struggling. Kindness matters. Generosity matters. But they aren't the same thing as abandoning your own clarity. I confused them for too long. The third thing, and this one I want to say carefully because I don't mean it harshly, is that you cannot fix a person's drift for them. Darren was 27 years old when I sat across from him in that kitchen. I don't know where he is now. I hope he's working. I hope he found something worth building toward. I genuinely do. But I know that nothing I gave him or withheld from him was going to make that happen. That was his work to do, not mine, not his mother's, not the account I should never have given him access to. My house is quiet now. On some mornings, that's the thing I notice first, the quiet. On some mornings, I sit on the back porch with my coffee and look at the desert willow, which is doing well, and I think about the man I was 3 years ago and the man I am right now, and they're not as different as I might like. But I know things now that I didn't let myself know then, and that counts for something, counts for a lot, actually. If you're sitting somewhere right now recognizing pieces of this story in your own life, the small charges you didn't ask about, the explanations you accepted, the account you checked less carefully than you should have, I just want you to know that you're not foolish for having been in it. We're not foolish. We're human beings who wanted things to work. That's not a character flaw, but it's also not a reason to keep not looking. Look. Check your statements. Know your numbers. Have the conversation before you have the crisis. And if you've already passed the point of prevention, if you're already in the middle of it, know that the other side of it exists. I'm standing on it. The desert willow is 7 feet tall now. I didn't expect it to grow that fast in this soil. Some things surprise you. I've thought a lot about the word cause lately. Not in any grand philosophical way, just in the plain practical sense of a man looking back at a sequence of events and asking himself where it actually started. It started with a yes I didn't think through, not the yes at the altar, that one I thought through as much as any person can. I mean the other. Yes, the one at the kitchen table, 3 weeks into my second marriage, when Suzanne asked if Darren could stay in the third bedroom for a little while. I said yes because it was the path of least resistance, because I wanted to be the kind of man who doesn't make things difficult, because I was 60 years old and I thought I had enough goodwill to absorb a small inconvenience. What I didn't understand then, what I understand now with the kind of clarity that only comes from having been wrong, is that every subsequent yes became easier because of that first one. The phone bill, the brake pads, the debit card access, each one followed naturally from the one before it, and each one made the next one harder to refuse, without it feeling like a reversal, like I was changing the rules mid-game. I wasn't changing the rules. I had never set them. That was the actual problem. There's a version of this story where I call myself a fool and leave it at that. I've heard that word in my head more than once over the past couple of years, but I don't think foolishness is quite right. Foolishness implies you didn't see it coming. I saw pieces of it coming. I just decided, repeatedly, that seeing it was enough, that awareness would substitute for action. It doesn't. Awareness without action is just a very well-informed kind of paralysis. What finally moved me was not anger. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story that people tell themselves where the hero gets mad and that's what makes him act. I didn't get mad, I got methodical. I got the spiral notebook out of my nightstand. I started writing things down. I added up numbers, and then I sat in the parking lot of a hardware store with a fraud alert on my phone, and I thought, I am 63 years old, I worked 31 years to have what I have, and I am done negotiating with a situation I created and have the power to change. That's the thing about intelligence, real practical intelligence, the kind that actually helps you live. It's not about being smarter than everyone else. It's about being willing to look at what's in front of you without flinching. Suzanne wasn't a villain. Darren wasn't a criminal. They were people who had found a comfortable arrangement and had every incentive to keep it going. I was the one who had allowed the arrangement, which meant I was the one who had to change it. And I did. Quietly, without drama. One afternoon at a bank branch, sitting across from a patient account manager, restructuring the access points one by one until the situation reflected what I actually wanted instead of what I had passively permitted. Darren said he was sorry. I believed him. I hope he's doing better now, genuinely. But his growth was never mine to manage. That's the part I carried longest. The idea that I could fix the drift in him by being patient enough, generous enough, present enough. You can't fix someone else's drift. You can only stop funding it. The desert willow I planted that spring is doing well. That's not a metaphor. It's just a tree that surprised me with how fast it took root in difficult soil. But I'll admit, every time I look at it, I think about the man who planted it. Quieter than the man who moved to Tucson with the second wife and good intentions. More clear-eyed, a little more himself. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this if they're sitting somewhere recognizing pieces of their own life and mine. Not that you're foolish, not that love is a trap, just that clarity is not unkind. Protecting what you built is not selfish, and it is never too late, not at 60, not at 70, not at any age, to look at a situation honestly and decide you deserve better than what you've been accepting. I know that now. I planted a tree to prove it.